Hi, my name is Taylor York, and I'll be talking about the impact of our changing climate and what it has on Americans' economy, examples of this occurring, what government and other organizations have been doing to combat this problem, and what still needs to be done, especially in regards to helping those in poverty. The weather and its conditions are highly unpredictable. It is often not known until a few days ahead of time when a major storm may strike. However, in the more recent years, extreme weather has been more frequent and damaging than in the past years. Take, for example, this picture from Hurricane Sandy 5 years ago, which took more than 117 lives and left thousands homeless. This major storm also caused more than $71 billion in damage. It is noted by Costa that in the year 2016 there were more than 15 extreme weather events with losses totaling over 15 billion in the US. This number only seems to rise, and with the rise of global warming has only made this worse. We see an example of the devastating effects of weather on the economy with Hurricane Katrina a few years back, which I'll discuss later. Extreme weather is costing the United States dearly, including its taxpayers. There has been more than 84 disaster declarations and $1 billion spending during these extreme events. Most of these events range from floods to hurricanes. The U.S. has issued more than 13,000 major disaster declarations, and the total damage from these events have been over $500 billion. More than 2,000 Americans have died from the extreme weather events from 2011 until now, and this number is estimated to increase, according to the article by Costa, Peterson, and Moreno. Scientists from NASA are saying a rise of sea level and temperatures are adding to the growing extreme weather conditions. In Maryland, the temperature has risen 1.2 degrees in the past century, and the sea levels in Virginia has risen 7 inches. Climate models estimate that these sea levels will continue to rise and temperature will also increase. These conditions are estimated to lead to hurricanes and damage, especially among shorelines. The government agencies and other organizations like planning commissions, conservative groups, and researchers are working to assess how much these climate changes will have on our regions and how much this will cost the country. According to information obtained from Wallops Island National Wildlife Refuges, the sea levels display a steady increase over the past decades, which you can see from the top charts. Temperatures have also displayed a similar pattern, displayed by the bottom charts. These patterns could have devastating effects for our country, including flooding, severe storms, and heat waves. Scientists and researchers agree that climate change has become a reality. Warming temperatures, increases in numbers of hot days, and an increase in the heat index has all been observed in this century. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has concluded that human activities are only adding to these worsening climate issues. The climate change will increasingly affect the poor populations. These populations do not usually have adequate access to drinking water and food, and their health could decline exponentially as a result of these weather events. These people who live paycheck to paycheck are also less able to prepare for and recover from these types of storms. The National Climate Assessment notes that global, long-term, and unambiguous warming trend is expected to continue, and this warming will create more record-setting extremes. These extremes will cause more heat waves, droughts, wildfires, storms, hurricanes, and flooding, which can ultimately not only have an impact on our crops and economy, but also our citizens. Some of the struggles that poor Americans encounter when dealing with damaging storms include not having enough money for moving expenses, according to the Federal Reserve. The cost of preparing and evacuating for storms can also quickly add up. Before storms hit, people usually need to board up windows, have extra food and supplies for a few days, have gas to evacuate or buy plane tickets, and have accommodation for family and pets. Few poverty-induced persons do not have adequate funding for this and are left to tailor the storms with the bare minimum and try to survive. Some government aid is provided for these people, but the most vulnerable populations usually never see this aid at all. Some people are unable to apply for homeowners insurance, according to the Miami Herald. Undocumented immigrants also cannot receive cash aid or unemployment assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Also, typically, the poorer states of the South and along the Gulf are the most likely to encounter hurricanes and storms. Agriculture is heavily dependent on climate and can have the hardest hits due to the climate changes. A study by Hertel, Burke, and Lobel concluded that understanding how climate changes impact poverty requires knowledge of the pattern of agriculture productivity shocks, as well as the patterns of trade, production, consumption, and poverties. Policymakers should target assistance to those who are most likely to be affected by the climate change. The poor usually does not have unlimited resources and instead are focused on day-to-day survival. Having extra money stored away for disasters may pose a problem for this population. They also may not have the means to evacuate as mentioned above. For example, Hurricane Katrina, many people did not evacuate the city because they did not have a vehicle. 2000 U.S. Census data projected that more than 50% of poor households in New Orleans did not own a vehicle. Insurance was also inadequate for homeowners to rebuild or repair, and the city was left in shambles. Climate change may also impact tourism, in which the number of days snowboarding or skiing that would occur in the north is reduced. The increase in number of wildfires could also affect national parks and hiking. Beaches could suffer from storms and erosions. Communities that support themselves through these activities would feel a huge loss as these things shift. However, governments, corporations, and policy makers have risen up in the issue and have worked towards creating a change. Businesses are realizing that climate change could put a damper in their operations. They have realized that it's a business opportunity with the low-carbon economy booming 3% each year. Other corporations, including Nike, IKEA, H&M, and Apple, have invested in combating climate change. These corporations realize that there is no greater threat to the global economy than climate change. It is also mentioned that internal factors such as company culture plays an important role for companies' adaptation of fighting the climate change issues. However, company scandals, including those at Exxon and Volkswagen, in which these organizations advertised a false, eco-friendly product, has led to much distrust by the American people. Companies are still being seen as a big part of the climate problem and are expected to be a big part of the solution. Businesses still have the responsibility to acknowledge the climate change crisis. Some policies implemented by policymakers have not only added to the climate change crisis and growing poverty. Biofuels include liquid fuels made from organic matter. The policy argues that ethanol and biodiesel will allow us to move forward with internal combustion engines while still reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. However, there are many skeptics surrounding the true success of this and what this process may cost for Americans. Oxford International states that these policies, such as biofuel policies, may allow rich country governments to avoid difficult decisions about how to reduce the consumption of oil. These critics state by increasing demand for agricultural land, they will drive the expansion of farming into critical carbon sucks such as forests, wetlands, and grasslands, triggering the release of carbon from spoils and vegetation that will take decades to repair. It is stated that these policies are driving up food prices and only adding to the poverty issues. The World Bank estimates that this crisis has already pushed 100 million people into poverty. Americans seem to be divided on how much to spend to battle the climate change. And a survey has indicated that 77% of respondents said they think climate change is real, and 65% stated that the government should do something about it. However, 42% of these respondents wouldn't even pay $1 a month to do something about it, where Democrats were found to be more willing to pay than Republicans were more likely to believe in the drastic effects of climate change. Many Americans, according to the New York Times' Michael Greenstone, are willing to pay for a carbon climate policy. This could be something our government may be able to look into regarding the climate crisis and creating a change, but Americans seem to be divided on this issue, with no clear leader emerging to fix the problems. Hurricane Katrina was an example of how extreme weather not only impacted the poor populations, but also how storms can magnify socioeconomic inequalities. Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans, disproportionately affected the poor populations. Property losses during this storm ranged from 70 to 125 billion, and more than 1,400 lives were lost. New Orleans is regarded as one of the most poor metropolitan areas in the country. If we compare this storm with Hurricane Andrew, which hit Miami, Andrew actually helped the economy and provided opportunity, whereas Katrina largely disrupted it. Without the low-class citizens of New Orleans, the richer parts, such as the French Quarter, wouldn't thrive as well, since this meant there would be no more workers to entertain tourists. The poor areas were also 83% African American, which highlighted a racial aspect to this. In a Gallup poll survey, 60% of blacks reported that governments were slow to respond to their needs after the storm, whereas only 20% of whites reported this. This racial underpinning made it even more politically difficult to rebuild the city. Compared to Hurricane Andrew, where the death toll was 26, the death toll for Katrina was over 1,500. After the hurricane, one disaster relief organization known as FEMA was in a crisis. When the hurricane first hit, the country was in relief because it would majorly impact not the wealthy, touristy areas of the city. However, after a few days, it became apparent that many of the poorer zones were without food, water, or shelter. Louisiana was overwhelmed as it seemed their ties with the federal government was not that strong. FEMA, therefore, met many critics during this time. It was mentioned that emergency management suffers from a clear lack of measurable objectives, adequate resources, public concern, or official commitments. In 2001, the Bush administration decided that its spending to greater accountability and included it in a larger organization devoted to security and terrorism protection. The levees in New Orleans were already poorly constructed due to poor planning, which President Bush was aware of. State and local agencies were not prepared to provide transportation and other basic needs in case of a crisis. Once the hurricane did hit, the government officials waited too long to issue an evacuation warning, and federal agencies were too slow to provide emergency responses. Due to its new refocus on terrorism, the department was not focused on natural disaster relief efforts. There was an obvious disconnect between preparedness and responsiveness. No one was prepared for how devastating the hurricane would be. These are some suggestions for government and ourselves. We can be better prepared for disasters by the U.S. government, so we have that backing them up. We can also incorporate risk mapping, which is knowing which populations are at the greatest risk and aiming interventions towards these populations, including which places have the highest number of elderly, children, and etc. We can also incorporate many more warning systems and better warning systems, which has actually approved. There also needs to be better preparation by FEMA and other disaster management agencies, and actively engaging and becoming aware of the climate change.